Good morning, everybody, and welcome to week 2 of Land Reuse Month 2022, hashtag Land Reuse 2022 if you're tweeting about this. My name is Euan Leitch. I am the Chief Executive of SURF, Scotland's Regeneration Forum, and I am your chair for the 3 sessions that we're having this morning, which are looking at collaborating with communities around the reuse of vacant and derelict land. So as I said, this morning we have 3 sessions, and our first session is looking at the benefits of community engagement and collaboration. And we have 3 panelists joining me for that. We have Linda Gillespie, who will no doubt be known to many of you through her work at Community Ownership Support Scotland. We have Nick Wright from Nick Wright Planning, who has done extensive work with communities across Scotland and the UK. And Rachel Cowper, who is the Programme Director for Children's Neighbourhood Scotland based in the University of Glasgow. And they're going to open this morning with their thoughts on why collaboration with communities is important to them and the work that they do. So Linda, can I give you 3 minutes to tell us why it's important to you?
Brilliant, thank you. Good morning, everybody. I suspect I will know a number of you. I work for COSS, and so we work with community groups and the public sector in the sustainable transfer of public assets into community ownership. And I would say community consultation and collaboration is absolutely at the core of everything we do. So that's with community groups, that they are actually consulting with their own wider community around about their aspirations for particular assets, kind of land or buildings, and the public bodies in their consultation and collaboration with those community groups. And with the kind of, I suppose, an element that I would like to come through this session about the kind of collaboration and consultation is around about sustainability of assets. So I think it's within everybody's interests that we kind of have sustainable futures for that. And I feel consultation and collaboration are key to that. Even with the introduction of the Community Empowerment Act, overwhelmingly, we are finding that communities still seek to take on local authority assets. And on one level, that's really positive in that local authorities have well-established routes to consultation with groups. They're well linked in, they have those connections, and they kind of know the communities. So I think that's a kind of very positive kind of element of the collaboration that comes through. I think for other public bodies, particularly those with larger sites, consulting and collaboration with communities can be quite challenging. And that's something that we're finding in our work. And I think it's worth pointing out that communities may only have an interest in a small part of the site. So there's kind of work to be done round about kind of developing routes and mechanisms for that. From a community point of view, we still broadly find that communities are working on the basis of threat and opportunity. So that's the threat of losing assets and the resulting services with them, which is kind of why there's a lot of focus on the local authority assets. But the opportunities that assets bring are kind of increasingly coming through, and they tend to be established community organisations that kind of can capitalise on that. And much of that is because they have their roots into communities, they're taking a strategic approach, they work on the basis of partnerships. So although there's a bit of a change, that threat and opportunity is still a key thing. There is a bit of a change coming through, and it's something that we are beginning to develop and work with communities, and that's round about the rationalising of the options available to communities. So one of the key things, particularly post-COVID, is the kind of potential volume of assets that are available to communities in a range of conditions, and actually where communities are participating in this, it's actually what they choose. So there will be an increasing need to just have a kind of enabling and collaborative approach with communities, because it's within everybody's interests that we have solutions for this. So that would be my kind of final point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. There's some good points in there which I've noted down that I may ask you about later, or there may be questions that come in through the Q&A. So thank you very much, Linda. And then moving on to Nick. I think you're up next, Nick Wright.
Thank you. I'm Nick. I'm a town planner. I'm freelance. I've been since 2004, mostly working, well, almost entirely for public sector and community sectors. So needless to say, my focus is on the value of doing community-led plans and engagement in planning as a part of the bigger thing. And I'm lucky enough to have done that around Scotland for years, be it town centres or community action plans, whatever they might be. And most of my work really is about brokering support and momentum within communities. Often there's lots of different points of view and disagreement, and between communities and public bodies, to make sure that their plans have support from everybody concerned and that they're workable and they're realistic. So two things I thought I would mention from recent experience to trigger some thoughts and hopefully some questions in discussion as well. One is about some research I was involved with in early 2020 with Stephen Towson, an ex-developer, which was for the Land Commission, and it was about the benefits of early engagement from the perspective of developers, which is very interesting because through discussions with 40 or 50 developers, we realized, well, it was a bit surprising that in fact switched on private sector developers see benefits for them in investing in early community engagement. And it was interesting that they were saying that rather than the public sector was saying they should do that. And I can talk in more detail later on if it's of interest, but by doing more early engagement, what those switched on developers found was it gives them increased certainty, helps them get planning consent, helps them get development moving. So they see benefits, and that word needs to be spread around as widely as it can, which the Commission has been doing. And in fact, I'll try and put links to chat, to some of these things in chat as I'm talking. So that was the first bit of recent experience, which I thought was worth explaining about. And then the second thing is the value of something like a community action plan or a local place plan, or whatever term you prefer for a community-led plan for a local community. That's one way that communities can get ahead of the game rather than wait to react to public bodies or to developers. Because basically it's, as well as an action plan for the community to do things itself if it has resources, it's also an invaluable shopping list for developers and the public sector to do things as well. So one example of that is a community action plan I was involved with in Euan Leitch, about 10 years ago now, quickly led to long-term community lease of a council-owned derelict old station yard in the very centre of the village, which was quickly transformed by the community into a green space. And I'll put a link into chat to that as well, which explains more about that. And that also refers to another example in Johnston Bridge, down on the M74, down towards Lockerbie, where the community action plan identified land for new housing and employment development more than in the LDP, but the council found that very useful because it helped them inform their next wave of local development planning and potentially release more land, more development than they thought they might be able to. I've got a couple of other examples I could talk about. Huntley, Room to Thrive strategy, community-led, led to support of 3 buildings on the main square there in the last couple of years. And I'll put a link for that in chat as well, in case anyone's interested in that or talking about it more afterwards. And then the final thing I wanted to say very quickly was, although most of my work is doing community-led plans or facilitating them, I found myself quite recently looking at community-led plans more and more as a source of information to understand local issues and aspirations. So I've been doing work in Ullapool and in Orkney, for example, and the community action plans prepared in the last few years in those places I found invaluable as sources of information about what kind of houses do people want, where are what are their aspirations, in order to then inform what a developer might do or what the local development plan might do as well. So there's a few things in there I've thrown in, but hopefully there's a few thoughts for chat later on. So that's me, and back to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nick. And that was interesting, I suppose, hearing, Linda's talking about the fact that communities reacting to threats and sometimes around loss. And Nick, you bringing in ways that we can actually begin looking at that by the planning system, so that we're not always reacting to things, but maybe getting ahead of the game. Thank you very much. Now, our final presentation or speaker is Rachel Cowper from the University of Glasgow. Rachel, do you want to tell us what engagement means to you?
Yes, certainly, no problem at all. Thank you very much, and hello everybody out there. So just by a bit of personal background for those who don't know who I am, my name is Rachel Cowper, and until very recently I led the Thrive Outdoors team at Inspiring Scotland. The Thrive Outdoors team is that Ron Seal moment. It does what it says on the tin. It was really around supporting better childhood health and well-being through access and engagement with the outdoor and natural world. There are rafts of reports that explain how the health and well-being of our children in this country is not what it could or should be. And really that piece of work was about supporting that. However, I recently moved on to the University of Glasgow, and there I lead the programme called Children's Neighbourhood Scotland. Now that looks at 6 particular areas of very high SIND, of which 3 are in Glasgow, 2 are in South Lanarkshire and 1's in Clydebank. And on that piece of work, it brings together part of my previous role, but most definitely looks at the voice and minds of children and young people. So working with them and speaking with them and supporting them to actually articulate what impacts their well-being. And this is where the answers to those questions actually fell back into my previous experience, in that those children nearly always spoke about safety. And when safety was investigated, it actually meant their local environment, what was outside their door, what was in their community, and what they felt was accessible and not accessible to them, and impacted their feelings of safety, whether it be litter, fly tipping, or the profusion of vacant and derelict land. Because we know from the data that's available, there is a higher prevalence of vacant, derelict land and stored spaces in areas of deprivation. My background also brought in a bit of economic regeneration. That's what I used to do sort of 15, 20 years ago before I moved to Scotland. So really this is a combined piece for me, where we can look at and work with those in communities to support and enable those assets and spaces to be better used for the community out there. So for me, collaboration is king. Actually working with real, true, honest voices from communities, hearing about what impacts them, hearing about what they want to do to support that change in their community, and working collaboratively with the agencies and the councils in those locations to bring these areas to fruition is a key part of the equation. And I feel this really ties into so many current agendas, whether we look at it being #NotSoPrettyVacant, or whether we look at this through the lens of well-being or community wealth building through the well-being economy lens. And the place principle. There are so many current agendas that overlap with what could and potentially be delivered for these spaces and assets for communities. And as a quick example, we've done some work previously, and one of our examples we've supported over the years has been identified in the #NotSoPrettyVacant report, and that's the Baltic Street Adventure Playground. Now that was on a stored vacant piece of land in the Dalmarnock area, so in the back of the Commonwealth Games. That site has gone from strength to strength over the last decade, with it now being an adventure playground. It's currently in the last throes of registration of becoming an outdoor early learning and childcare provision. It offers intergenerational activities, growing, the chance for children to see chickens and other things, but it's all on a piece of what was vacant and derelict land. It is the linchpin in that community now for what it can deliver and support for children and young people and their families. And I would argue that there are other examples, and I think we have Gillian later speaking about stored spaces in Glasgow. And certainly there's local growing projects that children from John Chapel were interested in creating for themselves. And that's certainly coming to fruition as well. And lastly, I'd just like to think about what vacant and derelict land looks like to most people. Often when we drive through or go through neighbourhoods where it exists, these are areas where it's often litter is strewn, caught in the brambles, neglected and left. But actually, if these spaces can be tidied and actually utilised, and as in one example in Castlemilk, utilised by children, it has an impact across the community to actually, as a community, start to look after that site better. So as a quick example, when we worked in Castlemilk, that community woodland there, although not vacant or derelict, was not used. and became a litter strewn place where wheelie bins were torched at the weekend and set fire to. Actually, as we started to clear paths in and started to go deeper into the woodland and work with the children, creating outdoor play and outdoor nurseries, more and more of the local community started collecting their litter and putting it by the bins. And less fire raising and fire torching took place because everybody knew the kids were going in there. And actually it has a positive impact on communities when actually these assets are brought back into effective use for the community, particularly through the lens of children and young people. So I'll leave it there and look forward to questions later.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And that was a good example to end on, I suppose, and it's something we can all visualise, those types of vacant spaces. Some of you, I think, Rachel and Nick, you've both kind of given examples. You've touched on examples. Do any of you want to sort of speak a wee bit more about specific examples where engagement with the community has resulted in a very positive outcome, maybe from a situation where there was no community engagement and there was some problematic piece of land or a building? Linda, I'm going to drop on you first because you didn't give a direct example. I don't know, from your perspective, are there any specific examples that you can think of in your experience?
Oh, I mean, there's loads. I know that I should have mentioned, I should have got in with Huntly first before Nick mentioned Huntly. Huntly's a wonderful example of a community organisation anchoring the kind of regeneration of their kind of town centre. And of course, that couldn't happen without the kind of effective collaboration and support from Aberdeenshire Council. So actually the council's role in supporting Huntly Development Trust and also an arts organisation that's involved in the mix has been pivotal. And the same is true of the kind of Stove Network and Mid-Steeple Quarter, where you're talking about, so the kind of examples that Rachel talked about, you know, very much about kind of derelict land. You know, a lot of the examples we've got are kind of derelict buildings, vacant buildings that have a slightly different, you know, a different kind of impact on the communities. You know, it is the burnt out shops in the middle of their high street that people get very kind of upset about as well. So kind of examples where there's been really good collaboration with the local authorities over those two town centres are super ones. We've got examples, just, you know, I was asking the team last night just what would be good examples to show really good collaboration and where there's been capacity building with the public sector. And, you know, Craig's Farm in West Lothian came through where the council kind of very much held the jackets of the community group and it sort of backfilled in capacity to deliver the project. So just these are really positive results where there's been superb collaboration with the public bodies involved in that. I mean, I could go on, you can come back to me.
I know you will have an extensive list of good examples within DTAS and COSS.
Yeah.
Nick, do you want to say anything more about some of the places that you've worked that you've seen the engagement with the community really resulting in something positive for both the community and the council or public body?
Yeah, just a very small one, actually. I think it's important to remember that there are good examples, as Linda said, of big things like Mid-Steeple Quarter and organisations taking over buildings. Those are big, expensive projects. There are also lots of examples of much smaller, more manageable things. And the one that's in my mind, Linda will have hundreds, I'm sure, and probably everyone who's listening has one as well. But the one in my mind is in Stromness and Orkney, where there was a small play park at the south end of the town, which was a bit of a state. It wasn't derelict, but it was very shabby and underused and could have become derelict. And council didn't have enough money to sort that out. So the Development Trust, as their first project, as a new trust, they undertook to redo that as a manageable project, only a few £1,000s, but that, you could say that saved a bit of land from becoming derelict and going down the line of Castle Milk, for example, as Rachel was saying, and transformed it into a resource. Not as all singing or dancing as the Baltic Street one, but it's a good example of a little thing that's doable, and it took a bit of collaboration to get there. So yeah. Okay.
A good example. I suppose one of the things that I'm reflecting on what I hear from you, and I suppose there's a difference from the examples that you've used in your introduction, Rachel, is issues around community capacity. So there are certain places that we know that have good community capacity, and I would say Mid-Steeple Quarter, Huntly, there are communities that have agency, I suppose. And Rachel, I suppose you touched on places that maybe there is less professional experience maybe within the community that can enable people to have governance issues and all those sorts of things. What have you seen good examples of, or what creates community capacity in those areas where there hasn't maybe been some before?
Yes, and possibly answers your question and actually the question I've just seen pop up in the channel, which is because we come at this predominantly through children and young people. So we look at it from what children and young people think and want. You know, they are not citizens in waiting. They are actually spending their formative developmental years in these communities surrounded by these spaces or places. And actually, previously when speaking to somebody at the Land Commission, we were talking about planning and spaces taking maybe 5 or 10 years. Well, that's taking a child 0 to 10. That's their foundational years of development where they've not been able to access certain spaces or places in their communities. And that's quite a quick time frame, maybe for longer term planning, new housing developments, but in a child's life, that's an amorphous size of time. So we try to work, and the example in question would possibly be Drum Chapel at this moment. When we worked in Drum Chapel, we did a lot of consultation with children and youth groups around what impacted their well-being. And this way it very clearly came out their community spaces, what they were surrounded by, truly impacted them. And this was that safety piece, and it pertained to litter and the volume of vacant and derelict land. But the area of Drum Chapel has a couple of key anchor organisations and has support from Thriving Places, but there isn't necessarily a body or a huge emphasis that's available there that can take on some of these sites. So therefore, we worked with the children and young people to help them articulate their issues, their views and their wants, and then brought them to and with the council so the council could understand what was going on. Because the council for Glasgow there did have an interest in addressing some of the issues that they could see, but in all honesty, the council, when they met with us on site, were thinking of it almost like an adult to adult piece. And actually, this is what the children are saying, and this is what the children wanted. So when there isn't necessarily the bespoke agency or effective table thumper, for want of a better expression, who can drive things forward, actually bringing forward the voices and facilitating that conversation to honestly happen is a good starter for 10 to create that connection through. And it has led to some really, really interesting discussions that are certainly underway with regard to some of the vacant derelict land and the kids wanting more outdoor play and outdoor learning space, which in terms of COVID recovery and getting kids back into school, outdoor learning is quite an easy way forward to avoid mitigation and infection, as it were. So there's additional pros and cons that come through from this.
Okay, you phrased table thumper is a good one, because a lot of communities have them, and they are good things, but they can also sometimes obscure other voices, but not every community does have them. Rachel's touched on a question, I suppose. I don't know if Nick and Linda have any response to Yvonne. Nick Wright asking, can the panel tell us what are the key aspects of consultation? Just missed it because Nick's replied. Key aspects of consultation, meaningful engagement at the early stages to inform the collaborative vision. So key aspects of consultation from your perspective.
Tip in three suggestions, but I mean, there's no right or wrong way of doing it, but 3 things I've picked up from experience and from hearing others with more experience are, first one is don't just jump straight in with proposals, but work out what it's all about. First of all, what you're trying to achieve, what's the vision in inverted commas. Second thing, get out to everybody. So as Rachel was saying, include young people, use social media, whatever it might be. Don't worry about the tools and the techniques. It's easy to get kind of hijacked by lots of attractive looking stuff, but think about the best ways of communicating with your community. And then the third thing, which is a slightly different scale, is set up a steering group or something of local people to guide, especially if you're an outsider like I would always be, set up a local group to guide what you do. And that includes if a local authority is starting to work in the community as well. And there's more on that in the link in chat about the government's draft how-to guide that I mentioned there. So those are 3 things from me, but equally Linda might have 3 completely different things. I don't know.
Linda, you don't have to give 3, but
no pressure. I mean, I wouldn't disagree with any of Nick's points. I suppose from our point of view, we are working from the communities coming forward. So we are responding to the community's desire to do something with a site or a building. Where there is a desire to retrofit something or find a solution and then consult a community on what that solution might be, it is a more challenging proposition. I think I fully agree with Nick's points, but I think there's also something about recognising the voices that are available locally in those fledgling groups. Now, we obviously work with kind of community anchors, so the development trusts tend to be community anchors. They are organisations that projects can get attached to, and they can be delivered through. But actually, 67% of our referrals in Glasgow over a kind of 4-year period came from the top 20% most disadvantaged communities. And when we actually did a kind of segmentation of those, what the profile of those groups were, a really high proportion of them were early stage groups. So when you're dealing with early stage groups, in addition to their proposals, there are the kind of governance structures and forming themselves. And actually, without community activists, where would we be? So it's actually just kind of supporting those voices coming through.
That's a very good point. Another question from Mike Batley is asking, does the panel think quick wins are important for communities when the time lag between consultation and seeing change is often a number of years? You're all nodding and saying yes. I think that's John. I think it's one of the observations around. We've just done an internal analysis for charrettes, and charrettes, obviously, some of them had very big aspirations, which maybe haven't happened because they are big aspirations that required large-scale funding. But some of them also included very small-scale interventions that could take place, and these were the ones that kept the community engaged. I suppose when we all met in preparing for this a few weeks ago, I sort of touched on something that's I'm aware of, and it's around community consultation fatigue and how we sort of deal with that, because we're all supportive of community engagement. But I suppose I was recently in a meeting with somebody, I won't say where in Scotland, who had been looking back at a settlement that had a charrette about 4 or 5 years ago. And then they looked and they said, basically the community had been consulted 17 times after that charrette on different things, on niche things. And obviously COVID has delayed a lot of things, but they were saying that's a lot of questions to be asking the community. How do we kind of get out of creating fatigue? What's the best way forward to make sure that we are engaging with the community meaningfully at a substantive scale that has longevity?
I throw one suggestion in, and this isn't the only way at all. I've been working with community groups just south of Loch Ness for the last year or so on the community action plan, and they're in the lucky position of having lots of wind farm money. So the first thing that they've done after the community action plan is set up a fund for any community group to tap into money to start work on anything it wants to start work on that fits with the action plan. It could be a feasibility study for a childcare service. It could be a bit of remedial work on some heritage structure that needs to be done that's falling down, but just small pots of £5,000 or £10,000. So that helped the quick win thing. And it also, by attaching, the basic point is having money attached to the plan is such a good thing to do. And it's where so many charrettes tried to do that and failed because there weren't resources attached to the plan. So that's the thing in my mind that's really helpful.
Okay, that's very, and it's very interesting. I suppose actually a lot of the discussion around NPF4 is around attaching money to some of the things that are in, and that's at a nationwide scale. Rachel.
I think just building actually on what Nick said, from our experience with children and young people, areas of SIMD are obviously the ones, as we've noted, who get asked and asked and asked and asked about various things from very different institutions, be it councils, consultations, universities, you name it. But what's the answer? They keep getting asked and they never see what comes to fruition. And this is where actually asking a question and asking the gamut of questions, which means if there's some low-hanging fruit and easy to deliver, actually if you deliver on those, it enables you to go back and refine when you're asking and developing plans with a community. That if they see there's some traction and some piecemeal pieces of activity or work that's starting to take place, it feels like there's a value to their time that they've had to commit. And often, you know, in these communities, particularly like more disadvantaged communities, you know, it's another bloody questionnaire. It's another something. And there is fatigue, there is a frustration. It's like, how many times do we have to tell the same story before something happens? So actually, it's that piece of actually saying, okay, well, thanks for your time, but you've said this, right, this is what we're going to go away and do. And once we've done it right, we maybe come back, but let's keep chatting and then process. And having a value and having an equal transaction, an equal transactional relationship, as it were, rather than just a one-way street.
Okay, good point. Thanks for that. I mean, that's interesting. I suppose I'm thinking about it as well, even from a, you know, working in a policy world, the whole, you know, we're all being consulted to death on new policies, and it's good that we're being consulted. But the ones that respond with, you said, we did, in changing something, changing a strategy or in changing a document, are the ones that you think, okay, I feel it was worth my while spending a time filling in a long consultation document. Linda, I don't know if you have any comment, because I suppose around, particularly in community ownership, I mean, there's a requirement for consultation, there's a legal requirement around asset transfer and all that sort of thing. Do you have any observations on avoiding fatigue?
No, not that would build. I think Nick and Rachel have covered the kind of substantive points around about consultation with that. I suppose there's just something about scale in these consultations. So we've you know, we've talked about kind of small towns and kind of quite ambitious action plans where you come over small settlements where they've done a community action plan. We kind of see more traction coming through from that. Actually, you know, the kind of East Ayrshire Council did their action plans with their kind of smaller settlements. So there was clear input into that. There was a kind of smaller scale that didn't necessarily get kind of swept up with other things. So it wasn't one plan necessarily amongst many. So I suppose there's that thing about scale and how that then feeds into the bigger picture and is accepted. Okay,
that's interesting point. I suppose one of the other, yesterday I said I was going to ask you a question about the just transition and how you felt community engagement should or does contribute to that. And I suppose I'm interested in any thoughts. I suppose so for the audience, the just transition is as we move from a high carbon form of economy into a low carbon one, there are obviously consequences for that. And I suppose actually what's happening just now around energy prices is something that's you know, very dramatic. It was very dramatic a month ago, and obviously what's happening just now in Ukraine is making this even more dramatic this year. I suppose in terms of maybe not particularly around fuel, around energy, but thinking around the just transition, what role do you think community engagement has in that? Linda.
Well, and this is through the lens of my world in terms of kind of community-owned assets, and that comes down to the point I was making at the kind of start, is about the number of assets. So the kind of policy on place that's kind of forming around about kind of 20-minute neighbourhoods, kind of, you know, place focus, place standard, etc. Not place standard, place focus. I think through the lens of community ownership, there are a lot of assets going available to communities. And I think there needs to be a kind of a much more strategic approach to which assets communities take on and are able to sustain, because communities aren't the answer to them all, but it's just actually supporting them to choose and take on the most kind of sustainable options.
Okay. So prioritising what is maybe available and having that very honest discussion about that. Rachel, do you have any thoughts on that?
Prioritisation, really. I thought I was sort of drifting into thinking about sort of some of the stuff we do in children. Prioritisation is key, and actually, for me, from the work we've been doing, it's about looking through the lens of priority for children and young people and what's important to them. We have, in terms of net zero, as was mentioned before, in terms of carbon reduction. There are ways and means these spaces can be utilised better that could meet the needs of children and young people in a more effective way, if this is what the children and young people want. The use for spaces to create outdoor play, outdoor learning and outdoor growing is something that supports many agendas and reduces the carbon footprint. And there are many aspects that fall out from this. And I'm thinking now, again, it's probably going to come up in the following session around the sort of local growing, local food and circular economy piece that certainly we're starting to see an interest in from the children. Now, whether this is the bounce from COP26, because nearly every school in Scotland did something about it, there is certainly some recognition in schools around local food supply, particularly in these areas of disadvantage that we've been working in. So a prioritisation of some of the views and thoughts from that aspect of society is probably something I would look for.
Okay, that's good points. Thank you very much. And Nick?
Yeah, I don't know about everybody else. It takes me a while to work out what these terms like just transition and community wealth building is kind of similar, I think, in some ways, what they all mean. I don't work in the policy world all the time, so I have to mug up on them. But I think the Baltic Street example that Rachel suggested earlier on is just a brilliant example of, if you work collaboratively, that's going to help to adjust transition, because, at the risk of using the jargon, it builds wealth in the community. It's community wealth building. I was reading a thing this morning on local people leading around the increase in population on egg and gear in the 20-25 years since they were taken over by their communities. The populations have gone up 75 to 80% in that 20-25 year period. Now, what better example of repopulation than the community doing it? So, I mean, I think those examples, Baltic Street and Gear, and there are lots of others, but they just show by community-led ways, what better way of doing a just transition. Yeah.
Thanks very much. That's really good. And I think Yvonne McBride made a really good point in the chat around it's beyond consultation, it's active involvement. And I suppose from a surf perspective, that's what our interest in regeneration is, that the communities that are experiencing regeneration are in control and in managing it and deeply involved in the regeneration of the community. But Alex Wild makes an interesting point, and it's one that I know comes up, that's come up in a few events that I've been at, around when we're asking for local expertise. And it's important that experts are paid, as I'm sure everyone would acknowledge. But how do we sort of make sure that the communities, is there a possibility of communities being funded in the same way when they're asked for their opinion? I don't know if you have any thoughts.
I think there is something about what's in it for them, and it's back to that piece I spoke about with the consultation and the quick wins. There may not always be the fee, shall we say, that can be paid to community groups. Funding and finances are always limited, but actually, what is in it for them? And actually, always think of it as being transactional. If you want something from them, what are they getting in return? And actually, I think coming to any discussion and recognizing that when we work with community groups who maybe, as Linda was talking, small groups, just starting, maybe small, limited on funding, this is time, this is money, this is effort from them, way beyond possibly the time and effort that we as coming into these sectors might be putting in. So actually, what do we do? Well, how can we compensate them effectively and appropriately? And that comes down to who you're working with and where you're working with, as to what's potential and what possibility there is there to do it. But it's actually keeping it in mind that it's a two-way street, not just a one-way one to get the data. Yeah.
Final question from Ian Wardrop. Good question. Does community engagement include all occupiers and users of local spaces, businesses, public bodies, such as health?
I can again say from our point of view, yes, it has been. The health and how the health and how public health is now structured with a focus on well-being and place. These are agencies that are vital in so many communities and not always considered. They will have additional data, which may be very, very informative for what you're looking to do, but also have that feet on the ground. They have workers out in communities who will be able to feed back exactly what they're hearing, exactly what they're seeing. So local businesses is a key one that often is ignored, small and large, and other sectors of our public society, like the health, are people who should always be consulted, in my point of view. And certainly when we've done pieces in the communities we've been working in of late, they have been linchpins to it all, really.
Yes,
Thanks
and
very much, Rachel.
I would completely agree with that. I would say many of the projects that communities are coming forward with have a kind of range of benefits, which they actually capture things like health outcomes as part of their delivery. So they are kind of naturally linked into the kind of services. I think there's round about the town centre type of work, I'm sure the local businesses are consulted in that, because at the end of the day, everybody wants kind of independence and a kind of revitalised high street. But I don't know that that's necessarily an obvious one for communities to kind of hook into businesses and actually take their views through.
I mean, I would say it's interesting, as I would say that the evolution of BIDs, business investment districts, is moving beyond it's the business community and then there's the other community. It's moving into a more, it's everyone that uses or shares that space together that should be involved in the management of it. Nick, do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, clearly the answer is yes, I agree as well, to Ian's question. And it's not a but, it's not a qualification. It's very difficult to do it though. And I can think of lots of examples in my head where one player in the party has tried to control the other players. So it could be the community, the residents who are worried about business owners. It might be the local authority somebody in the local authority is trying to impose something. It could be the government is trying to push its policy and override some local aspirations. The only way to achieve the yes is through everybody coming to the party and having a well-facilitated discussion. And there are so many examples that everybody in the room will know where one person or one organization has tried to control the others. And that's the but, that's the caveat. It's not to say don't do it. We should do it, but it takes great care and thought to do it so everybody has an equal say. And it's back to what Rachel was saying actually about, children and young people have to be part of that. You've just given lots of examples, Rachel, of how they haven't had an equal say. So that's an example of it.
And that's why it's good facilitation for that community discussion and making sure that facilitation does encompass everybody. It's 10:15. Linda, Rachel and Nick, thank you very much for your contributions, and thank you very much to the audience for some of the questions that you've dropped into it afterwards.